Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning into our final session of the Google Ads Accessibility webinar. We've covered a lot of content today, and we'll finish with a session that will equip you with the frameworks, tools, and best practices to hit the ground running as you work to improve your site's accessibility. More specifically, our next speaker will talk to us about ads and forms accessibility and provide us with a tactical next steps guide that you can use when you go back to your next project or campaign. Our final speaker of the day, Rain Michaels, is a certified professional of web accessibility and an interaction designer on Google's central accessibility team. Before joining Google, Rain led user experience overhauls and accessibility remediation efforts for a variety of clients in higher education, entertainment, and tech, including UCLA, USC, Sony, Participant Media, ICANN, and SAG-AFTRA. Rain also taught UX and accessibility at General Assembly and a handful of colleges. Thank you for joining us today, Rain. Let's get started.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining this webinar, and I'm very excited that you're taking the time to really dive into the practical aspects of creating flows that are going to be accessible, ideally from beginning to end. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Our objective right now is to identify those key areas where you can improve your accessibility in your ads and forms immediately without sort of investing a huge amount of time in researching or having to completely unpack everything that's already been created and have to build it again from scratch. We're also trying to understand the technology, the sort of the technical terminology behind these guidelines and specifications, because they can often be fairly confusing or feel somewhat obtuse if there's something that's new for you, or if you've never actually had the physical experience of trying to work with some of the assistive tech that these guidelines were designed around. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll feel confident that you understand the resources that are available to you to help decipher those things that really aren't clear yet, because we're only just grazing the very surface of what's available for you to work with. And then I'm also hoping that you feel confident by the end of this that you have your sort of next steps guide for what you're actually going to do this afternoon or tomorrow when you next sit down and try to start working on your campaigns. We're going to start by thinking about the technical stakes of not doing this. And I know that you've probably heard a fair amount of what the stakes are and had the opportunity to gain a certain level of empathy from the previous talks. Right now, I'd like to just take a moment to actually sort of demonstrate for you some of the areas where these failures can have a massive impact. Inaccessible experiences or inaccessible products make it impossible for potential customers or community members to complete your calls to action. This means that you will actually not be able to reach a significant potential segment of your market because you won't be able to have them get all the way through from beginning to end for the campaign that you so carefully put together to try to make people excited and try to get them to come to you or engage in some way. 1 in 5 people in the US is what we estimate based on the last US Census, which is about 10 years old, possibly older. 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability. This number only accounts for people who have a permanent diagnosed disability that have declared their disability on the census, which means that it's probably a significantly smaller number than the reality. The World Health Organization estimates that around 15% of the world, at the time that this number was calculated, that's about 1.05 billion people in the world live with a disability. And the World Health Organization classifies that as kind of a strict definition. So individuals with impairments or activity limitations and participation restrictions. And it's also important to note that some of this can be the result of the frameworks and sort of structural societal foundations or resources and how they're actually built, which might be built in a way that is not accessible and therefore somewhat unnaturally compounds or makes reality the difficulty of the disability itself. But there's an additional factor to this that that's really important to consider. So in addition to that 1 in 5 number where we think about the actual metrics of here are people with permanent disabilities who have declared them in some medical way, Our daily experiences as human beings will often place us in temporary or situational conditions that simulate the technical impact of having a disability. So what does this mean? Well, there are some illustrations on this slide that hopefully give you some kind of sense of what this means, with the first one being an individual who's in the snow. So this person's vision is rather obscured. This individual is also wearing gloves, so their ability to tap on touch targets or to manipulate small things will be impacted as well. The second picture is of a man holding his baby in one arm and taking a selfie with his device in the other hand. This individual is experiencing a form of motor impairment in the moment because he only has the use of one hand, which means that his dexterity is limited. It's also farther from his body, so his control of his finger is going to be less sort of detailed than it might be if he were able to hold that phone closer to his body. And then the final one is hopefully one that you absolutely have no experience with whatsoever, but it's an image of a driver with their one hand on the wheel. And in this condition, there also appears to be a lot of fog in the background. So again, we have low visibility, so vision is somewhat obscured. The user only has one hand. Hopefully, in fact, the user has no hand at this moment and is only using their voice. And hopefully, in the context of their device, they actually have no vision at all because hopefully they're looking at the road, not at the device itself. So these are also situations where the user has to engage with your campaign, if they are encountering it, in exactly the same way that somebody who might have some kind of disability would also be engaging. So if you think about designing for accessibility and you make sure that your designs are easy to see and they're clear and they're sort of beautifully laid out, and you put this thought into it from the very beginning, it's going to be pretty easy to make sure that your products are accessible, right? But what could possibly go wrong? Well, here are a couple of examples from real situations. So as mentioned before coming to Google, I worked with a lot of fairly well-reputed organizations that have huge legal stakes in whether or not their tools were accessible, and I got to help them with some remediation efforts. And some of the real actual things that we found inspired these examples that I'm about to show you. So here's one, we're talking about missing fields. In this example, what we're looking at is a very simple form. So if you're putting out an ad campaign, maybe you have, this beautiful ad that takes somebody to a simple form, and you say, okay, well, this is great because it's going to be very easy. No matter how distracted they are, we're only asking them for 4 fields. The fields are big, they're easy to get to, the targets are easy to touch. And so the user tries to fill out that form. Most important information for you in this form is their email address, because that's what you actually want as the advertiser. However, in this example, we have a situation where something called the DOM, which is spelled DOM and stands for Document Object Model, has been artificially restructured by the developer. So the actual elements in the code itself are not in the order that we're seeing them visually. Visually, we should see those 4 form fields, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the sign up button. But what's actually happening on the back end is the user, if the user is not navigating with their eyes, if they're using a keyboard or a screen reader, what they're experiencing is the first field is the name field, then the shirt field, the shirt color field, and then the sign up button. And they don't actually get to the email address or shirt size button because in the document object model, those buttons actually, or those fields actually come after the sign up button. This means that as the advertiser, if you had this in your actual campaign, you would not be able to get the email address from the user. And that is the most important information that you actually want to make sure that you get. Another example of something that can really easily go wrong, and that I've seen happen in cases where you would think it really wouldn't happen, is when you have the designer put some very careful thought into beautiful type, the style looks great, it's great contrast, everybody can read it, big font, it's very easy to read. But It's all been hard-coded with absolute numbers. And then a user comes along who requires an alternate font, for example, that they've set up in their settings. In this case, the font being used is a font called Open Dyslexic, and it comes from a Chrome extension that some individuals with dyslexia find helpful for them in reading content. When Open Dyslexic in this instance is applied to this particular example, because everything was hard-coded, now the text itself is overlapping and it can't be read at all by anyone. These examples are just a couple of examples of what can happen, and they're mistakes that are very easily preventable if you start thinking about some sort of simple preliminary areas where you can be looking at the work that you're doing and making sure that you're building in the accessibility that's needed. So let's go ahead and take a more careful look at what those options are. The first step that we're going to go through here is a fairly kind of big picture review of the guidelines to try to sort of understand what these are. We're going to look at WCAG WCAG 2.1 Level AA. WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the reason why we're looking at these guidelines, there are others that are out there, but we're looking at these because most countries around the world are requiring, most governments and organizations that are making sort of legal requirements of their users or of companies that are putting content on the web, are saying that WCAG 2.1 Level AA is the baseline standard, the bare minimum that needs to be met. It's very important for you to look carefully at the rules in the area that you are actually going to be trying to release your product, because there are different rules in different jurisdictions, within sort of sub-jurisdictions within countries and different countries. But at the base level, having a comprehensive understanding of WCAG 2.1 Level AA is going to get you most of the way towards what you need to do to ensure that you're meeting sort of that legal minimum. So there are 4 principles of accessibility according to the WCAG guidelines. Those principles are often pronounced as POUR, P-O-U-R, which we didn't write here because that can sound kind of funny, and we're obviously trying to think of it as much more than sort of POUR guidelines or POUR principles. But it is helpful to remember that acronym because it can help as you're sort of looking at your products and thinking about, is this actually working the way that I need my campaign to work? And what these guidelines mean at a very high level are that your work, your campaigns are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable means that the user knows what's there. They can actually find the buttons. Let's think back to that form that I showed earlier on, where the user would never know that that email field even existed. That email field is not perceivable to a user who's navigating by the keyboard. Operable means that the user can actually operate the interactive elements that are available to them within the campaign or product or device, that they're able to press the buttons or activate some kind of an interaction point that might be essential. Understandable means that what they're interacting with is clear, logical, makes sense. The user knows what's expected of them along the way. And robust will mean that as technology changes over time, the baseline of your code and your structure is going to be clean enough that it will be able to adapt to the changes in technology. We're going to take a closer look at perceivable. At a high level, what making something perceivable means is that you have sufficient contrast. You're not relying on color alone. You're using alternate text for images and not relying on images to convey essential information. You have descriptions available for complex graphics or graphic-based information, and things are logically ordered in your document object model. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, let's take a look first at sufficient contrast and what that means. So the WCAG guidelines specify that 4.5 to 1 is the minimum contrast ratio between colors in order to ensure visibility and legibility. So what does that mean? What is a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio? Well, there's an illustration here on the slide that shows white to black. White to black is 21:1 in contrast ratio. So when thought of in that context, 4.5:1 doesn't actually sound like very high contrast. It's not sort of asking a huge gradation between colors. We have here some illustrations of what each of those kind of gradations or different ratios might look like. The second in one here is kind of a dark gray, a very dark gray, and a very light gray. And this meets what we consider to be what is actually 7.5:1, which is what conforms to level AAA standards in terms of the WCAG guidelines. Level AAA is a very kind of high marker of accessibility and very hard to reach, which is why AA is what people usually find to be the standard that they're trying to get to. But if you want to go all the way with your contrast, you can aim for a 7.5:1 ratio, and you'll know that you have pretty sufficient contrast to make your content visually accessible for a lot of your users. I also indicated here what 2:1 looks like. And the reason why I included this is because this is actually a very common accessibility fail on the web. From a visual design standpoint, subtle differences between colors, a light pink on a medium pink, a light gray on a dark gray, or dark gray on a light gray, these tend to be very appealing from a visual design standpoint. So designers will often sort of navigate towards this kind of range, and it's not accessible. And you can actually see here when looking at it, where at a very base level, it just becomes hard to read. But imagine if you were trying, or maybe you are trying to look at this in a high contrast setting where you're outside and the sun is beating down on your device screen. At that moment, you won't be able to see these differences or see what the color code is that's indicated in that image. So another really important part of color is realizing that there are individuals, many individuals, who are colorblind, or maybe not colorblind, but they don't necessarily recognize the differences in colors. Or perhaps they're not seeing high enough contrast on their screen right now for any number of reasons. And so the colors aren't as clear as we expect them to be. So a key part of accessibility is to not rely on color or any single modality alone to convey information, but to find ways to kind of ensure that information is conveyed in many different ways, through text, through icons, through color, so that any kind of user who has a different way of perceiving what they're trying to look at is able to take the cues to decode the meaning that you're trying to present to them. Another very simple example right here of a very common fail in forms, if you're, say, trying to get somebody to sign up for a mailing list, for example, is the use of color alone around the border of the field to indicate that there is an error. So in this case, we have a sign up for mailing list field, and it's bordered in red to show that it needs to be fixed because the wrong information is in there. Your users may, who see that red, they may know what that means, but they may not. But your users who can't see that red, they won't have any idea that that's where their error is. So an accessible alternative is you can still keep the red border, but to also include an icon to make it easier to kind of quickly visually identify that something is wrong, and the addition of help text, letting the user know how to fix their error and move forward with the form. Probably the most famous kind of rule of accessibility is to always think about alternate text for your images. And this is a really important one. When information is conveyed through an image, whether that information is an emotion, a concept, or actual important information, it's very important that there's a way for somebody who can't see the image to access that information. However, it's also important to think about the fact that you're not just creating some kind of text that the user gets in order to make sure that they know what the image is. In the case here, we have an image of grass. So if my alt text says grass, I think for those of you who can actually see the image, you can kind of clearly see that just calling it grass doesn't actually convey the feeling or meaning that is being missed when you can't see this image. So an example here of alt text that might more effectively convey the intent and get that feeling across to the user, instead of image of brown grass, would be brown grass swaying in the breeze, or meditative brown grass swaying in the breeze, something that kind of captures the mood and gives the user a sense of what they're not getting because they're not able to see it. Along the same lines, it's very important to try to avoid using images to convey your text. So if you have something that you need the user to be able to read, you'll want to make sure that it's available in some kind of text-based form. Google is talking to me. You'll want to make sure that it's available in some kind of a text-based form so that you can have your users who might be relying on screen readers or other ways of accessing that material so that they can actually use it. Interesting point to also consider is that search engines will more easily be able to crawl text than they will be to be able to grab information out of images. So your campaigns are going to be more findable if that important information is in a text form as well. All right, another obviously similar topic here in terms of perceivability is sometimes you are trying to convey complex information such as graphs or charts or infographics, and the user won't be able to decipher this content. Another really good example might be if you have a picture, if you have an image of an art painting and it's a course and you're trying to kind of get the student to sort of figure out what the meaning is within that art painting. If you simply have alt text that says, painting of Blue Boy, your student isn't going to be able to start to derive meaning out of that. So the alt text in that case won't be enough. Or in this case, alt text saying pie chart, 15% of people have disabilities, might not actually be enough to convey the meaning that's trying to be expressed. And in this instance, then you would want to think about descriptions, text descriptions that go with your images in the code that are longer chunks of information that will more holistically give the user the equivalent information of what they should be getting from the visual itself. We also talked about a proper document object model, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but definitely taking care to make sure that the order of the elements in your experience is logical. And if it has been artificially restructured for visual display purposes, to make sure that you go through and programmatically set what that focus order is going to be so that your users don't miss out on key elements. This also ties into operable. Some of these guidelines are a little bit fuzzy in terms of they sort of blend into each other. But let's take a closer look at what operable means and kind of break that down. To make something operable, you'll want to make sure that your users can interact with the elements with whatever tech they're using. We'll talk more about that in a minute. You also want to make sure that things are large enough for your users to tap and that they're kind of transformative enough or responsive enough that if a user is using their device in landscape versus portrait, or if they have a large or small device. You also want to make sure that your users can zoom in and out so that they can see what they, or access what they need to, and that your flows can be completed all the way through from beginning to end with various technologies. You'll also want to try to make sure that your experience and those flows are not frustrating to people with assistive technology by offering ways to bypass large chunks of your content, especially your navigation. We'll look more at that as well. And you really definitely want to make sure that your users have enough time to complete the tasks that you're asking them to do. There's a couple more on here, but we'll get to them as we start breaking this down into detail. So let's look at this first one here, usable with assistive tech. What this really means is you don't know what technology or tools your user is coming to your campaign with. So even if you've created a mobile campaign, for example, and you're expecting your user to come with their sort of touch and interact with their thumb, your user might actually be using eye gaze or switch technology where they have two buttons that they maybe press with their jaw in order to interact with the interface. And that might be what they're using, not the touch finger. It's incredibly common for accessibility to fail because the interactions themselves have been coded to respond to click and hover events, which are dependent upon a mouse, without actually necessarily taking a couple of extra steps and ensuring that there are other trigger events that are also available to the users to activate those interactions. So the important thing here is to really think about the fact that ensuring that the mouse and the keyboard are not the only ways that the user has to interact with your campaign from beginning to end. This does require testing. This is probably one of the more onerous of the guidelines that are available, because you need to make sure that you actually have some of those technologies available to you, or users who can test with those technologies. On a more simple level, just simply making sure in your design and in your build that the touch areas that you create are actually large enough for somebody to trigger is going to be really important. WCAG specifies 44 by 44 dp as the kind of smallest size, or pixels, depending on what you're working with, as the smallest size for an adequate touch target. However, Google's material design guidelines actually takes that a step further and suggests 48 by 48 for the Android developer guidelines. So that's really meaning to just kind of make those spaces bigger and make it easier for a user to kind of activate those touch targets without actually activating the wrong one. Sometimes we think about, well, okay, maybe I'm not designing for, sometimes that kind of dexterity might be needed by a certain group of people, and I'm not designing for a group of people who don't have that dexterity. But one of the things to consider is that there are also kind of temporary or unnatural moments where dexterity might be limited. For example, individuals with RSI who 90% of the time aren't impacted by their repetitive stress injury, but then about 10% of the time they can't use certain limbs within their arm. Or thinking about an individual who's going through chemotherapy and perhaps experiencing a little bit of nephropathy or something where they're not feeling in their hands, or they're really cold, so they're shaking and they can't in that moment actually tap on something. We already kind of talked a little bit about being responsive to whether it's portrait or landscape. In my days before Google of doing audits, I also saw a lot of situations where the teams and the products would think, well, okay, we're going to set it up so that it works this way because that really makes the most sense for the flow, and not necessarily realizing that there would actually be an impact on users who, for one reason or another, might actually have to have the device another way. It's a little hard to kind of imagine this if you're not in that situation, but to maybe think about somebody who's a Switch user whose device is mounted because they actually can't hold it. That Switch user won't necessarily be able to turn their device one direction or the other. So if your experience doesn't actually work in whichever way they have it mounted, they'll never really be able to engage with your experience. Another thing that can happen a lot is users who have low vision or are tired or any number of reasons, they might zoom in and pinch and zoom on the experience, which means that some of the aspects of the interface sort of go off. Go off the screen. This is a hard one to kind of account for. You're never going to necessarily make sure that users always know that something has gone off the screen. So it's one that you kind of have to test for, engage, and use your intuition when sort of thinking about the interface that you've created. Testing being probably the most important thing here. But the important guideline, and the one that you can follow, is to make sure that you never, or your developers never, set the maximum scale to 1 or turn off user scalable. And this is something that happens a lot because designers will feel uncomfortable about the sizing changing, or developers might not have the time to ensure that everything is flexible enough so that it still works when it's zoomed in and out. So it might be kind of a quick prevention mechanism to say, okay, well, the interface will break if the user zooms, so let's make sure that they can't. But now you've actually ensured that the interface breaks for many users even without the zooming. So that can be a common mistake. Again, we've kind of already gone through this example with the form, but the point here is to make sure that your flows can be completed all the way through. There's another point here that I do want to call out. If you have your fields in this form be set to required, when I first showed you this form and the user could never fill out the email address, I didn't indicate if the email address itself was actually required, but just that you, as the advertiser, probably want that information. But in this case, now let's actually take the next step and say you're requiring that that email address be filled out. So now when the user fills in their name and the shirt color and then gets to the sign up button, they can't actually activate that sign up button because they haven't filled in the required email address field. But they don't know that the email address field exists. So not only are you not getting key information, but the user is literally not able to complete the flow at all. One of my favorites, and also often forgotten, is allowing your users to bypass large chunks of information. The example that's shown here is a web example, but this is equally true for mobile. If your user is using, say, a keyboard or a switch, they might be going through a fairly laborious and time-consuming process of navigating through all of the elements on your experience in order to get to the thing that you want them to find. A really nice thing that you can do for your users is give them these what we call bypass blocks, these sort of little markers throughout the experience where they can skip large chunks to get to the thing that they might want to get to quickly. This one is an interesting one. The one that we're looking at right now is the idea of providing your users with enough time. There are often business critical reasons why you might be restricting the amount of time that a user has to engage with your experience. And one of those kind of common reasons might be you're holding a ticket for them. Maybe you have a limited number of spots in some kind of an event that you're trying to get people to sign up for. And you're holding one of those spots for them. So you don't want them to just start the process of that form and never finish it, because now that spot might be held indefinitely. And now you can't fill your event to capacity. However, if that amount of time is something that is kind of built in a way that the user who might need more time isn't actually able to ask for more, or is presented to them in a way that might be stressful, you know, the big red button or the big red countdown saying you only have 3 minutes left, something that might cause anxiety, you're now creating an inaccessible experience, but you're also creating one that's going to make the user feel a little bit less excited to engage with you or to participate in the event. The next thing to look at, we're almost done with operable, this is the big chunk here, is to make sure that the purpose of your elements is clear. What is the purpose of every interaction point on that screen? What's happening here? Are your labels clear? Will people understand what's going to happen the next thing that they do? The first example that's placed here on this slide is one that is less obvious and not necessarily seen most of the time. But it's an example to make sure that labels are programmatically assigned to form fields. So this is something that developers will need to make sure that they do. That anytime there's a form field, that it has something that is actually programmed as that field's label, so that when a screen reader user is entering information into the field, they actually know what information is required of them. But the next example here is really looking at link purpose being clear, link or button purpose being clear. What will actually happen when the user clicks on that link? What a lot of people who aren't familiar with screen reader usage won't necessarily realize is that screen reader users have these very efficient ways of getting through their getting through pages and forums and experiences and flows very quickly. And one of the shortcuts that they can take to really make sure that they're not spending a huge amount of time just trying to go from thing to thing is to pull up a list of all of the links on a page, which means that sometimes those links are going to be out of context. So if you have, for example, a label that says read more, when that label is taken out of context, the screen reader user has no idea what read more actually means or where it might take them. This last one in the operable area is one that I really want you to pay extra special attention to, because it literally is life or death. It's a little strange to think of what we do as life or death, but in this case, it actually is. So motion. Motion is wonderful. It helps bring people into your experience. It helps capture their intention and bring them delight. It's actually a very important and very useful part of what we do when we're creating these campaigns. However, if you're not careful about the potential sort of amount of motion that's happening, you could at best be causing motion sickness, and at worst, you could actually trigger a seizure. So the guideline for this, the WCAG guideline for motion and how to handle motion, is linked on this slide, and I would strongly urge you to have everyone on your team take a look at this to make sure that you know what those thresholds are that actually create that risk, so that you're not accidentally falsely creating that experience. One other very important thing to make sure that you're doing is that everything that you build respects if the user has their prefers reduced motion setting enabled in their accessibility preferences, so that if they don't want motion, they don't have to get the motion. All right, a little bit easier now that we've had that big, huge word of warning. Let's go on to understandable. We've already sort of started to talk about this because, again, all of these guidelines kind of fuzz together a little bit. But really the key of understandable is the meaning clear? Are the interaction behaviors expected and predictable? If somebody clicks on something, will that click cause an event that the user actually anticipates, or in some way be an event that the user is comfortable with, rather than one that causes anxiety or commits them to something that they didn't intend? And when you provide forms, which is especially important when you're thinking about ad campaigns, are you creating forms that will assist the users and set them up for success, as opposed to ones that might actually make it difficult for them to get through to the very end? In more detail, what does this look like? Well, so for the meaning of words to be clear, the example that's actually put in here as a visual is thinking about icons, because we do often use icons as our interaction points. So in this example, we have 3 icons that are very common interaction points for a user: edit, help, or the question mark, and then the floppy disk for save. But we commonly use the pencil icon for edit. And it might be logical in one's mind to say, well, the label for that pencil icon should be pencil, because this is literally a pencil. But what the label actually needs to be is the label that conveys to the user what the intent is, not the label that necessarily exactly describes what is being displayed. Because to the non-sighted user, pencil might not indicate edit. So the clarity is going to be very important. And this is also going to be really important when thinking about clarity in all of the symbols that you choose and all of the language that you choose throughout your experience. Will it be clear to non-native language speakers? Will it be clear to people with different cultural backgrounds who might have different meanings or expectations in the language that they're encountering? Also thinking about cognitive differences or cognitive disabilities and situational impairments, where somebody might sort of not understand something because they're not paying enough attention to it with everything else going on around them. Along the same lines, making sure that the symbology that you choose and the words that you choose will lead to predictable experiences. So an example that I've actually seen quite a lot is sometimes there will be a design that uses a back arrow, or kind of an arrow pointing left. And when it's clicked, it will actually scroll the user to the top of the page. This can be very confusing for some users, and they might think that something's broken or they've made a mistake, and not really realize that that was actually what was expected. So to make sure that the choices that you make are predictable, understandable, that they make sense. And then this last one is input assistance on forms. So as you build your forms, you'll want to do everything that you can to make sure that the users can enter things in ways that make sense to them. We all have different ways of writing dates and phone numbers, and somebody from Europe actually writes dates with the month first, whereas somebody from the US writes dates with, maybe I got wrong, writes dates with the day first, and then somebody from the US writes with the month first. So there's all kinds of different ways that we write information. To make your fields forgiving and flexible enough that they will take whatever format is natural for the user and then move it into what it needs to be for the machine. To give them clear labels and instructions, help them through the process of filling out the form, and don't make them guess at anything. And then we already talked about clear error messages. And this final one is error recovery and prevention. How do you make sure that your user doesn't make a mistake? And they will make a mistake. So if they do make a mistake, how do you help them recover? So for example, if you're offering them the opportunity to delete something, asking them first if they're sure so that it's not permanently deleted and gone would be a very nice thing to enable them to do. And then the final guideline here is robust. This one really looks towards the future. You're thinking about how can you make sure that as technology changes, as new assistive tech becomes available, as people change in the way that we use this technology, will our experiences be able to survive those transitions? And there are really only two good ways to do this, because you can't necessarily predict what that future will look like. The first way to do that is to make sure that your developers are always using proper semantic markup. Rather than taking shortcuts or using sort of stylistic tricks to make things look a certain way, you want to make sure that when something is a header, that it's actually marked up as a header. When something is a quote, it's actually marked up as a quote. Because as long as those HTML5 best practices are being adhered to, and the code is clean and it sort of follows those standards that everyone is using right now, then even as technology changes, it's going to change in a way that will make sure to respect those standards that are key to ensuring that experiences are accessible. The other important thing that you can do is to make sure that your status messages themselves are accessible, that they are perceivable, operable, and understandable, so that when situations do happen where your experience breaks or where something goes wrong, that the user gets a status message that they can actually receive and understand, so that they don't feel like they're just kind of out and lost and something is broken and not working without having any sense of the next path. Those are the guidelines. We got through all of them, and I spoke so quickly to get through them. But now that we've gotten through them, there are a couple of other steps in this process. So the first step was that massive one: understand the guidelines, or at least have the slide deck or whatever tool you need handy so that you can constantly refer to it as you're working. And the next step is to really respect the user. You don't know what technology they're using or why they're using that technology. So assume that when it comes to the tools that the user is requiring or taking advantage of to engage with your interface, that they know best. They know what works for them and how they can actually survive and get through your flow. That really means respecting their personalization settings. Respect prefers reduced motion, respect their personalized contrast settings, their personalized font styling settings, and their personalized input mechanisms. And rather than forcing them to adhere to some kind of a design and input method that you have pre-configured. And then step 3 is really about taking responsibility. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit didactic for a moment, because it's really important to understand that, that everybody who touches the product, look at this slide here, every single person who touches the product, the campaign, whatever experience you're creating, is responsible for accessible design. And when I say every person, I really do mean everyone across that experience, from the stakeholders to the project managers, to the UX team, the visual designers, the developers, and the QA team. At a very high level, what does this mean? Well, the stakeholders are the ones who have the opportunity to set the tone and to establish the priorities from beginning to end. They're also the ones who have the opportunity to hold everyone else accountable and determine what the requirements actually are. The project managers are the ones who have the opportunity to make sure that everyone has the necessary resources to create accessible products. They're the ones who will not let the team save accessibility for later because they're trying to meet some kind of an early deadline or sort of fit within a sprint without thinking about accessibility. And they're the ones that ensure that everyone on the team has the adequate time to do what they need to do for accessibility purposes. The UX team is the team that's going to understand the diverse needs of the users and be familiar with the various modalities that the users might be coming to those flows through, and to consider what those various interactions might be so that they're not sort of considered second-class interactions, but are part of the overall design of that flow. They're going to build these considerations directly into the personas so that the considerations can move all the way on through testing, and you can ensure that accessibility is more easily and carefully thought through from beginning to end. The visual designers, of course, have a fairly large onus, as we've seen, in terms of making sure that the product or flow or whatever it is that's being built is accessible. Because the visual designer will be thinking about the cost requirements, the various states of the experience, making sure that things are clear and simple, and that there are alternatives for motion, and that the designs can actually adapt to the user settings without breaking. And then, of course, the developers are the ones who will implement that in an accessible way, who will respect the document object model or provide alternative ways for a user to navigate through the elements if they've unnaturally changed the order of items in the form. They'll also be the ones who make sure that labels are programmatically assigned and that there are alternatives. The developers are also in the unique position to catch mistakes from other team members leading up to that point, because they'll be the ones who will see that something may or may not actually be accessible. And so they'll be able to stop and say, oh, wait, this isn't accessible. Let's go back and start asking the team what we need to do in order to make sure that we can have an accessible experience. And then finally, there's the QA team, and this is really important. Everything should be tested, ideally by also including users of assistive tech in the testing process, because no matter how smart you are, experienced you are, you will make mistakes because you are not necessarily an assistive tech user, or even if you are an assistive tech user, you're not necessarily using another piece of tech where you may or may not really realize what the experience will be like for that particular person. So really, when it comes to accessible design, everyone is responsible. And if anyone in that entire chain sort of assumes that it's somebody else's job and lets it sort of be considered by the other team members, accessibility is actually likely to break down. And with that, let's try to come up with a checklist. But here's the thing, checklists, in this case, checklists are kind of meaningless because every experience and every flow is very unique. So it's very hard for me to say, well, here's your actual checklist that you're going to make sure that you follow on every campaign and ensure that that checklist will be as comprehensive as it needs to be. But there are certain things that we can make sure that you're kind of thinking about that will hopefully give you the resources that you need to ensure that your own sort of checklists or processes are as comprehensive as they need to be. So what does this include? The first one is to ensure that everybody on your team has empathy and recognizes their own individual responsibility in releasing an accessible campaign. I apologize if you can hear my dog on the recording. Also, to build accessibility traits into your personas and into your journey maps. What are those experiences that you expect people to go through, and what are the unique traits that they might have? And to actually think through those at every step of the way. Another really important part of the checklist is to remember the 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. If you stick with those 4 principles and you always look through your flows and your campaigns with those in mind, you will naturally start to catch some potential issues that maybe weren't so obvious before. And then, of course, including individuals with disabilities and with a diverse range of disabilities in your testing. With that, we do have some resources here for you. One of my favorites over the years has been the WCAG 2.1 Quick Ref Guide. This is a very kind of consolidated form of the WCAG guidelines and makes it very easy for you to quickly see what those guidelines are, while also linking into the incredible and dense amount of information that's available around those guidelines. For your developers and your designers, the WCAG Quick Ref will also lead to practical links that will have examples of code or examples of designs that you can make use of. We're also very proud of the material design accessibility principles that we've linked here, as well as the material guidelines that are available. And these guidelines can really help you get a head start on accessible designs. And then Google also has a number of developer resources available. So please follow that link and take a look at some of those resources in order to review your campaigns, your products, whatever you're building, to make sure that what you're creating is actually effective and accessible. That was a lot of information, so thank you for bearing with me, and I'm really excited to see what you create as you're thinking about these considerations.
Thank you so much, Rain. That was incredibly informative. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'll be sending out a short survey for feedback, as well as the presentations from all of the various sessions. We hope that today's content proved to be useful regardless of where you are in your accessibility journey, and we look forward to supporting your efforts in the future. Thank you again for tuning in.